It's my great pleasure to introduce Isabel Hofmeyr today. But before I do that, I just want to say that I'm speaking on behalf of the Center for Interasian Research at Ahmedabad University. We have had this, like a long-running series, I would call it, webinar series on the Indian Ocean and beyond, outward bound from Gujarat. We've had a number of really excellent speakers last semester, and here's Isabel opening the innings this time around. Really delighted to have her. I've known her over the years in many different places, and I've always been struck by her, her friendliness, her gentleness, and the incredible persuasion with which she's able to speak and bring you across to her side of the argument. She used to be a fellow at my center in Bangalore a long time ago, and spent wonderful several weeks researching, teaching there, and tried out some of the ideas from one of her books, which is the Gandhi book, I think, at that time when she was there. It was nearly 15 years ago, I think. But of course, I have encountered her subsequently and not been able to keep up with her amazingly prolific output. I so look forward to reading the new book on hydrocolonialism. But I do want to say in terms of, like a welcome, some of you may not know Isabel Hofmeyr's work as well as I do. I just want to flag that she's Professor Emeritus now at the University of Witwatersrand. She's based at the institute called WISER and is a distinguished scholar in residence at New York University. She has just been a professor of African literature at WITS and global distinguished professor at NYU. Over the last 3 decades, she has pioneered research on global, oceanic, and transnational forms of literary and cultural history that seek to understand Africa's place in the world. She's a leading scholar of the Indian Ocean world and more recently of the oceanic humanities. She has explored textual circulation in the global south with a focus on the Indian Ocean. Her books include The Portable Bunyan, A Transnational History of the Pilgrim's Progress, Gandhi's Printing Press, Experiments in Slow Reading, 10 books that shaped the British Empire, creating an imperial commons, co-edited with Antoinette Burton, and now Dockside Reading, Hydrocolonialism and the Custom House, 2022. Isabel Hofmeyr has served as acting director of the Center for Indian Studies in Africa, which is the co-host of the series, which she helped to establish, and we can't be more grateful to her for having done that. So yes, I mean, Isabel is multifaceted. I know she's also an artist, although she doesn't declare that anywhere in her biodata. I'm sure that her creativity will come into this talk as well. I'm looking forward very much, as I'm sure you all are, to hearing Isabel Hofmeyr today. I'll call on Dilip Menon, my co-host, to say a few words about CISA.
Good afternoon, everyone, and Happy New Year to all of you as we kick off the new series for 2023. We had an excellent set of speakers last year, and all the speakers tried to connect up with this theme of in the Indian Ocean world, as it were. So while a lot of the papers were centered on Gujarat, they pointed to much larger geographies that extended from Burma to North America, including the Arab world and East Africa. So in that sense, the idea of thinking with the maritime actually has meant for most of the scholars we had last year, ranging from Ranisa Mavani to Fahad Bishara and Jyoti Gulati Balachandran, the idea of thinking about these interconnected spaces and connected oceans. So the Indian Ocean becomes merely a nomenclature that's used by historians, because obviously lives and ideas transcend these artificial boundaries of the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian, and so on. And so it's a pleasure to actually now listen to Professor Isabel Hofmeyr, who is both a colleague and a compass for people at the University of Witwatersrand. And it was Isabel who led the whole venture that led to the establishment of the Center for Indian Studies in Africa at the University of Witwatersrand, of which I'm currently the director. This Center for Indian Studies is now a virtual entity and is, as they say, desperately seeking funding. but we shall leave that story aside for the present. Over to you, Teju.
I have nothing else to say except to welcome Isabel again and ask her to make her presentation now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Teju, for that really wonderful introduction. And I think I spent time at Teju Center in Bangalore it's been what, 2000 and something, 2004, 5. And really that was if I look back, that really was the beginning of a number of projects, including this one. And it's wonderful to also have old friends and colleagues in the audience, Lakshmi Subramaniam, who's one of the great pioneers of Indian Ocean Studies, and Tradeep Sarud, who in fact I collaborated with. He did a wonderful piece for that 10 books that shaped the British Empire. And thank you very much to everybody else for coming. So what I'm going to do is just really give you a sense of this book, Dockside Reading. And then I'm also going to do a second part of the talk, which is describe to you the project that I'm embarking on. And it's very, very early stages. So I'm in desperate need of help. So any suggestions you might have will be gratefully received. Okay. How long shall I speak for? About 40 minutes or so?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Okay. So Dockside Reading then, this project took shape some years back in the wake of my previous book, Gandhi's Printing Press Experiments in Slow Reading, which explored Gandhi's newspaper and printing endeavors during his South African sojourn. So one minor theme in the book was Gandhi's steadfast opposition to copyright, which he regarded as a form of private property. So having completed the book, I wanted to investigate this thread further. Was Gandhi's position unusual or not? What was the situation with regard to colonial copyright? So rather surprisingly, the search led me to the Dockside and the Custom House, since, as I discovered, it was this department that had overseen copyright. So printed matter, as you can imagine, coming largely from outside the colony, had to be funneled through the port city, where customs officials checked to see that it was not pirated, seditious, or obscene. So customs officers hence became the part of the colonial state that oversaw both copyright, for pirated works, and censorship for anything that they deemed, undesirable. So I sought out the Customs Archive in South Africa with some trepidation, expecting dry and tedious reports on taxation and tariffs. Instead, I found a fascinating archive teeming with objects, in some cases actual ones like swatches of fabric, labels of tin, condensed milk, and packets of seeds. The documents themselves were filled with arguments about what these items actually were. Was the substance butter or margarine? Was there a difference between tea and medicinal herbs? Was a young pilchard the same thing as a sardine? So the Custom House then was far more intriguing than I had anticipated. Now, had I done this project 10 or 15 years ago, I would no doubt have written a drier book focusing only on the print culture implications of copyright and censorship in the Custom House without considering its coastal location. So while Gandhi's printing press had situated itself in the field of Indian Ocean studies, like much scholarship on the maritime world, there was not much actual sea involved. Instead, the ocean featured as a backdrop for human movement at sea, more surface than volumetric depth. So after of course, the last decade, rising sea levels and climate catastrophe have impacted powerfully on oceanic studies itself, which now grapples with how to go below the waterline and to engage with the materialities and ecologies of the marine world. So Dockside Reading then, I think, is an attempt to embed print culture in this new oceanic studies to put water and paper closer together. The book tracks the printed matter from ship to shore and through the regulatory regimes of the Custom House. The setting is late 19th and early 20th century Southern Africa, with glimpses towards other parts of the British Empire. The study traces how customs dockside protocols shaped understandings of copyright and censorship. And the argument is that it's the procedures in relation to cargo that are then transferred onto books. So in copyright, for example, rather than being an institution associated with the rights of authors, which is how we think about it today, copyright became conflated with cargo and commodity markings, especially a thing called mark of origin, made in Australia, made in England, etc. So British copyright became a token that a book had been made in the metropole and so was implicitly white and safe to admit. So colonial copyright then was hence construed as a logistical inscription and a kind of racial trademark. So as regards censorship, material was not read so much as treated like other forms of cargo, scanned for markings and sampled for traces of offensive material. Tax collectors at heart, customs officials were not keen readers. Instead, when dealing with a suspicious book, they applied the same techniques they did to other suspect cargo. They sampled, they counted, they measured, they smelled, and they touched. So rather than reading them, they assayed books as objects. So books were hence routinely judged by their covers, their language or script. French was always suspect. Non-Roman script was, often sort of considered dangerous. Inspectors focused on outward metadata like title, copyright, publisher, rather than content. So like other suspect cargo, objectionable books became seen as potential vectors of contamination. So the reading methods then of the custom house were to feed into subsequent apartheid censorship practices, which in part drew on the methods of these earlier customs inspectors. So the literary consequences then of the custom house eddied outward, not only across the dockside, but at times onto and under the water. So customs inspectors dumped unclaimed, smuggled or banned items into the ocean, as did passengers approaching those ports where pirated reprints of copyrighted works were not permitted, and they would, in order to avoid a fine, throw the book into the ocean. So the two terms that bookend my title are Dockside Reading and Hydrocolonialism, and they constitute the larger framework for contextualizing these two case studies of copyright and censorship. The first term really provides a micro view of the dockside procedures in relation to cargo and how these are transferred to books. And the second term furnishes a larger framework for theorizing these types of shore-shaped literary formations. So just very briefly, the book discusses dockside reading under 4 headings: objects, bodies, books, and reading. And the sections on objects argues that ports are shaped by the objects that pass through them. Cargo determines work routines and the architecture of ports. So liquid, for example, requires gauging, tea, sniffing, fabric having its thread count reckoned. Heavy substances like iron or building stone had to be examined on the wharf. Lighter, more portable material in warehouses. Meat required refrigeration. Timber demanded cranes, and so forth and so on. So the sections on bodies argues that these practices around objects were also transferred to bodies. Policies of fumigation, disinfection, and quarantine were first applied to objects and then transferred to people. On Ellis Island, immigrants were tagged, chalked, and marked as if they were cargo. Indentured Chinese laborers were classified as bonded merchandise. So the transfer then of this carceral orientation onto human bodies is clearest obviously in the case of Atlantic enslavement, where people were branded like wine barrels and crammed into holds. Across the Atlantic world, customs officials were intimately involved with receiving and processing enslaved people who were regarded as dutiable commodities. So the section then on books explores how customs officials classified and read books. Books were generally classified as a subspecies of paper, or in the words of the Indian tariff, paper and its applications. So books formed part of a paper world of pro forma blank documents, which is the bulk of what gets printed, like receipt folios, membership certificates, letterheads, labels, tickets, and so forth. Where books do feature, they often resemble forms like account books, birthday books, Boy Scout registers, cricket score books, and so on. So when books were suspicious in some ways, customs officials then had to read them. So, and unsurprisingly, they treated publications as a form of miniature cargo. So their outer covering perused then for logistical inscription, their inside subject to the same protocols of, as I said, measuring, sampling, and counting, which was deployed on other troublesome consignments. So customs officials, as I said, then they assayed books rather than read them. These modes of reading, I think, produce implicit definitions of what the colonial book should be. And one of these, I argue, is this idea of the book as form, okay, which is basically a template from the metropolis, like a membership certificate or a letterhead, that was then filled in with local scribbling. So quite literally a case of form over content. And many colonial novels, follow a similar pattern with a generic blueprint from the imperial center, boilerplated with provincial content. So the book as form also featured in settler and immigrant handbooks, which included the forms to be completed on arrival. So these fusions of handbooks and forms helped to land immigrants, guiding them through disembarkation formalities and making them legal, as in the phrase landed immigrant, somebody permanently and legally admitted. So these volumes, I argue, we must think about as part of port infrastructure and its land reclamation, which quite literally reached out to incoming passengers of the right class and race, giving them their first purchase on the colony. So we might think of these settler handbooks with forms as a mode of textual land reclamation or landfill, extending literary infrastructure outward to enable the immigrant, as I said, to become landed. So these genres of the dockside, I think, can be usefully inserted into debates on Southern African literature, which I'm sort of work on. I argue that we can see that as we can see that between these two key colonial genres, the story of the shipwreck on the one hand and the farm novel on the other. So just as port cities were intended to overcome the problem of shipwreck and to offer safe landing to settlers of the right race and class, so this book as form assisted in this process, offering settlers traction on the colony itself. And the institution through which many settlers achieved this aim was the farm. And as J.M. Coetzee has famously argued, the farm novel became a key intellectual instrument of land possession and dispossession. So the section just on reading takes the customs reading practices in relation to current post-humanist object-oriented ideas of books and reading. I compare customs readings to digital literary criticism, where reading by metadata and algorithm is routine. Customs officials did not have reverence for the book as a humanist object that would change consciousness. It was simply more cargo, a form of kind of uncooperative stationery. Their methods then of half reading, I think, accord with a lot of current book history approaches that is very interested in not reading, non-reading, or semi-reading. And if you know Priyasha Mukhopadhyay's work, you'll be aware of this. Sorry, I think there's Satyam Kumar is waiting to come in. Can somebody admit him? Okay, so the term then hydrocolonialism, as I said, is proposed as a conceptual framework for these themes that I've set out. It's a neologism, and it riffs off, obviously, the term post-colonialism, and like that concept has a wide potential remit, which could include colonization by way of water, so various forms of maritime imperialism, colonization of water, occupation of land with water resources, the declaration of territorial waters, the militarization and geopoliticization of oceans, a colony on or in water, the ship is a kind of miniature colony or the penal island, colonization through water, flooding of occupied land, and importantly, colonization of the idea of water, so establishing water as a kind of secular and empty resource. So modeling itself then on post-colonial theory with its cultural remit, hydrocolonialism traces the configuration of literary institutions across land and sea, empire and environment. It explores the literary implications opened up by overlaying the hydrological cycle onto imperial and post-imperial cartographies. This move requires us, I think, to think laterally, vertically, and contrapuntally between different water worlds and hydro imaginaries, while exploring how such circuits have been or might be narrativized. There are, of course, now a number of really exciting water-linked approaches: critical ocean studies, wet ontologies, immersive methodologies, blue humanities, hydrocritical approaches, black hydropoetics, atmospheric and elemental approaches, and so on. And so I see, hydrocolonialism as a rubric that's joining that community. And in my particular, in this, it's intended really as this broad, portable term that can be applied in many different ways. Particularly in this book, I'm interested in two things, and that is colonized water, how is water colonized, and what I call creolized water. So just as regards colonized water, the theme, it explores themes both above and below the waterline, and the way in which submarine infrastructure, and port, harbor engineering and development established colonial governance over bodies of water. Briefly, as regards creolized water, this theme investigates pre-colonial understandings of water as inspirited by different spiritual beings and how these interact with colonial ideas about water. Okay, so just a bit more on each of those. So one, with regard to colonizing water, it was a kind of aquatic territorialism by which land was extended into the sea, either literally through reclamation and submarine infrastructure, or by the extension of land-based methods of governance over the ocean. So promulgations of sovereignty, port regulations pertaining to the intertidal zone, declaration of quarantine stations over areas around ships, and so on. The book also looks briefly at port engineering, which is a central narrative of colonial possession and a founding mythology of port cities themselves. The harbor engineer becomes a minor, imperial figure, a tireless soldier who takes on the Sisyphean battle against sand. And I think the submarine imperialism is only starting, I think, to find a kind of conceptual vocabulary. So Ben Mendelssohn's work on Lagos offers an instructive example, which demonstrates how, quote, sand and related coastal geomorphological processes interact with the city's political and imaginative trajectories, as well as its historical legacies. Okay, so on to creolized water. And, this would be true actually of any body of water, especially, in any imperial or post-imperial setting. Southern African waters are especially creolized, being the imagined domain of African ancestors, Khoisan, roughly First Nation water spirits and deities, Muslim water jinns, associated with enslaved communities brought under the Dutch to the Cape, as well as imperial ideas of maritime manliness. So the concept of creolized water, I think, can usefully be put into conversation with Black hydropoetics and the Middle Passage. Ancestral and aquafuturist, to use Susanna Chan's term, a body of creative and scholarly explorations experiment, of course, with the Atlantic undersea as a realm of speculative diasporic histories, with the drowned communities of enslaved people. So I think putting this Black hydropoetics in relation to Southern African creolized water opens up suggestive submarine cartographies, and these might map how Southern African, oceanic ancestral traditions relate to the drowned communities of both the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, the arena from which Cape enslaved people were drawn. So I think once one considers this enlarged realm, the dramatis personae expand, taking in the jinns and genies of the Indian Ocean, the ancestors of the African oceans, the submerged deities of Indian indentured communities, and the ground of both the Middle Passage and the Indian Ocean. Okay, there's then a sort of summary of each of the chapters, which I'll skip just very briefly. There's a chapter that sketches out the workings of customs in the British Empire, focused through a biography of one particular person. There's a chapter that looks in detail at the procedures that customs followed. Then there's a chapter on copyright. There's a chapter on censorship, and then there's a conclusion. So you'll be very pleased to hear it's an extremely short book, which several of the reviews oddly have complained about, which I find rather strange. Anyway, so that's for the book. And so let me then move on to much more uncertain territory, which is a new project that I'm trying to do, arising out of this book, roughly called Elemental Reading. And as I've indicated, this concept of hydrocolonialism is joining this community, this really interesting community of rapidly expanding sort of blue humanities, wet ontologies, hydrocriticism, and one that I've become particularly interested in is elemental media studies. And it's this idea that we can think about elements as media, that most elements perform the functions of media, which is to store and transmit forms of information. So the obvious example is John Peter Durham's book, Marvelous Clouds, which looks at a whole range of media, but the obvious example is clouds, which we look at both for information about weather, but also for a sort of infrastructure of the imagination, And there's now huge amounts of work, on air and atmospheres and ice and all, really sort of fascinating and rapidly expanding field if you're interested in it. So I was really interested in it to think, there's this very interesting field of elemental media studies. How do we put print culture and book history, very traditionally very dry areas, which think about media as dry forms of inscription, So how do we kind of think that in relation to all of this emerging kind of blue humanities, or whatever you want to call it? So, can one think about books, reading, and print culture elementally? And what would that project look like? So I'm fortunate that there are already, I think, some book history scholars who have started down this path, exploring themes of kind of eco-bibliography, bibliography, the study of book history. And they're exploring really in material books, in material terms, sort of the elements in books and the books in elements. And there's a really wonderful book by a guy called Joshua Calhoun called The Nature of the Page, Poetry, Paper Making, and the Ecology of Texts in Renaissance England. And it explores the sort of, firstly how paper was made, and he's interested in the way in which animal, vegetable, and mineral matter that goes into paper making, and the influence of what he calls these habitats on textual habits and transmissions. So as he describes it, these animal, vegetable, and mineral matter move through society in textual form. And he's sort of interested in that intersection. And given the organic nature of the page, one central question he poses is, how has human communication been altered by the corruptibility of the non-human matter used to make texts? So just another example, Emma Solberg, who's a medievalist, has got a wonderful, delightful piece called Human and Insect Bookworms, which, quote, reconsiders this ancient rivalry between human and insect bookworms as a mutually constitutive partnership and even a co-authorship of the text. So any collection of books or manuscripts represents, of course, something of an evolutionary opportunity for insects. And she demonstrates this really interesting thing about insects tend to treat books as a kind of habitat. So if it's rather like a log, so they would tend to be on the outside, on the exterior, and they behave often much the same way in relation to books. And she notes they tend to make their tunnels, holes, and burrows in the covers, gutters, and margins, the same blank spaces aptly filled by medieval illuminators who painted moths, spiders, and caterpillars. So bookworms, little negative doodles and tiny punctuation marks really obscure meaning. It is as if human and insect bookworms were meant to read together. So there's, if you're interested, there's quite interesting work starting to come from different dimensions. Monique Alawat has quite an interesting radical theory of colonial textuality that draws on African diasporic ideas of the fetish, which is an assemblage that presupposes, quote, a relay between non-human and material forces on the one hand and human creation on the other. Okay, so or put differently, it's a co-constitutive relationship between the materiality of the world and the materiality of the sign. Okay, so it's not an arbitrary relationship, which is the sort of standard way of thinking about it. And she's interested really in the way that this kind of thinking could be applied both to Africa diasporic texts and Western colonial documents. Just more examples. Hester Bloom, if you're interested, explores polar media, looking at the ephemeral textual productions of Arctic and Antarctic travelers, and how these kinds of texts and productions of text had to then accommodate themselves to these extreme environments. Okay, so and then just if I can say in a slightly different register, myself and a colleague, Sean Lavery, traveled to Antarctica in 2019 and produced a piece called Reading in Antarctica, which is mainly really about not reading in Antarctica, where everything is governed by the elements. So the elements determine when one can read, what and how. If seasick, you're not really able to read and you must turn from print to audio. And even when not nauseous, and if the seas are very rough, you keep having to look up from the book to the horizon, to sort of fend off further seasickness. So Antarctica rapidly turns one into a reader of elements and an elemental reader. Okay, so this project then, I'm imagining a short book of 4 essays, roughly with a sort of fairly predictable definition of elements, books that end up in water, books that are buried, books that are burnt, and books in the atmosphere. Okay, so let me just talk very briefly about that. And as I said, it's at a very rudimentary stage. So the sections I've started on is thinking about books in air or atmosphere and what that atmosphere brings. And to use Calhoun's term, to think of biodeterioration, change wrought by living organisms. So as he indicates, these themes raise the questions of, quote, how ecological conditions of book preservation inflect reading practices. And I aim to bring a kind of post-colonial lens to this question, taking as my point of departure the late 19th and early 20th century Cape archives, which was heavily assailed by the paste beetle, which was eating its way through various records. The chief archivist who then took on the task of trying to get rid of these insects was a man called Louis Perringway, who undertook a program of fumigation, which formed one of his many activities. He was head of the archives, he was chief entomologist, and as Sirat Rasool's work has demonstrated, he was also a grave robber involved in acquiring Khoisan skeletons in order to pursue racial science. So I'm interested in that spectrum and thinking about this, the fumigation of insects as a sort of very miniature instance of colonial governance. And I can talk more about that if you're interested. Okay, I've also been interested in Anna Singh's idea of the feral infrastructure, which is set out in the sort of team project that she and others did called the Feral Atlas, which you may have seen. And it's interested in this process where non-human entities become entangled with human infrastructure projects, okay, and the unexpected consequences of those. And these constitute what they call feral ecologies. And I'd like to see whether one could adapt this term to think about a feral archive, okay, where a human intellectual infrastructure interacts with these non-human entities. And also, obviously, I'd like to think about this in the as much in the past as the present. So post-colonial archives has for long operated under conditions of austerity, political repression, and humid climates. And there's very interesting work by Edgar Taylor on Uganda, which looks, in fact, how the colonial archive itself was always underfunded and patchy. And it was very dedicated, it was very, governed by policies of secrecy and suspicion, which of course carry over into the post-colonial regime. And one of the most difficult jobs often in a post-colonial regime is being head of archives, because you don't want people coming in there finding things about contemporary politicians. Also, just interestingly, I think it's a point that the Joshua Calhoun makes, is that the idea of the archive itself is often premised on continuous electricity and air conditioning. And so, of course, how does one then think about an archive once those conditions can no longer be assured? So that's also, as I say, part of what I think this project might entail. Okay, let me fast forward a bit here. Okay, so just very briefly then, the books on water would be some, I'll kind of move fairly rapidly through that. That will develop some of the ideas that I first started to think about books and water through this dockside reading, customs officials throwing books into the ocean. Also, these passengers throwing books as they approach port. It's often a set piece. There's a piece in the Langston Hughes biography as he sails out of New York on his first voyage as a sailor, and he throws out a whole lot of books, which indicates sort of leaving one life behind and starting a new one. So I want to think about those sorts of issues, also questions of flooded libraries, which will become more and more a common occurrence. Libraries lost at sea is, something that one can also think about. And apparently, as I understand it, Ambedkar's library was also lost at sea, although he was fortunately in another ship. Books in fire and buried books, just very briefly, I mean, obviously books in fire, there's the problem will be too much information. I'm thinking of three possible routes. The first would be the hidden fires of apartheid, where banned books were burned, not as a political spectacle, but as a bureaucratic procedure, when libraries removed banned books from shelves. Another sort of major book burning episode was just prior to the political transition in 1994, when the apartheid regime burned incriminating documents for weeks on end. And I'd like to try and follow that up more. Also, this book burning is very often part of the spectacle, one of the set spectacles of anti-apartheid resistance, most notably the past burning campaigns of the 1960s. And then the third and very recent strand was the student-led movement, Roads Must Fall and Fees Must Fall, in which, in fact, one library was burnt and attempts were made to burn down others. And I think these very interesting developments drew, on the one hand, on ideas of Afro-pessimism, emanating from scholars like Frank Wilderson, in which anti-Blackness is seen as so pervasive and systemic that there's no possibility of fixing anything, and it should therefore all just be burnt down. And another strand, I think, in this movement, which fed into it, is indigenous ideas, of a burning and apocalypse, a kind of millenarian imagination, that we must burn down the old world in order to bring about the new. Okay, just very briefly, buried books would look, I think, a lot of books were buried under the Anglo-Boer War, the South African War, and then many books were buried by political activists during the anti-apartheid struggle. And I'm sort of interested to try and find particularly those cases where people don't remember where the books are buried. So again, you have this sort of idea of the lost library, and to try and see how people then remember those kinds of books. Yep, and I think that's it, and I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Isabel. That was really rich. And there are so many elements we could pick out to ask you to take forward some of the questions that you have raised. I know that everyone here will have questions for you, but maybe I could, abuse my position as moderator of the discussion and begin to throw out a couple of things for you to address. I'm fascinated by the idea of the creolized, sorry, what was it? The
Creolized water.
Creolized water, yes. And I was thinking about that as you were speaking, because it seemed like, I mean, of course, we come from a literature background and we associate creolization normally with language. And then it's come to be talked about in relation to ethnicity. But here you are talking virtually about objects. And I found that quite fascinating, how you translate that term Creole into another zone of engagement, if you like. And I wondered then, if you were to reintroduce language into that field of creolized water, yeah, because I think you mentioned several kinds of objects that seem, I want to hear those objects, and I'm not hearing them. So I wondered, if you were to reintroduce language, what would that creolized water sound like? And what are the linguistic elements, if you like, that might make up creolized water? Yeah, I had another question, but maybe I'll come back. Would you like to address this briefly?
Okay, thank you. I think it is, okay, so I think there's sort of two levels to the question. The one, I think, is partly, it really is a metaphysical imagination, okay? So obviously it's expressed in language, but it's this idea of all of these bustling sort of spiritual communities that fill water. So water is this incredibly busy substance. It's kind of informed, if you like. It's got these forms, it's got all these different communities. And I think that the really interesting thing there is in Southern Africa, it certainly functioned as one of the most durable archives of popular memory. Partly because it's always, I suppose, a little bit under the radar. It's probably always quite a sort of localized, although not necessarily, imagination, but it's really it's a really powerful way of banking a whole series of sort of pre-colonial forms and imaginaries. So I think that's a really, really important feature. In terms of, I suppose, I can give you one really interesting example, in fact, which comes from one of our graduate students, Mapule Mohulatsi, and she got interested in this idea of creolized water, and then said, oh, but if you live in a township, previously black segregated area in South Africa, everybody knows the figure of Witwatersrand, okay, so which is an Afrikaans term for the water spirit or the water maiden, okay, and I think that is a very particular, it's a sort of example that would, if you're interested in the linguistic, where I think it's Khoisan's enslaved communities and those Khoisan communities have long sets of interactions with African communities. And so I think out of that, and Afrikaans, of course, is this classic Creole language which emerges out of the situation of enslavement. And so I think those ideas, particularly these Khoisan ideas about water spirits and water maidens, interact then with enslaved communities and interact with African ideas of ancestors, and then produces this term Witwatersrand, which carries them, it carries all of those strands within it. So I think if you probably looked, and I haven't done this, if you look much more carefully at the range of terminology by which these sort of figures are the terms that are used, you'd probably find very, very similar sorts of things. And I think also just there's a whole sort of, in Southern Africa at least, a whole sort of, one of the ways of the forms of debates about decolonization is an attempt to, obviously turn to the pre-colonial. And I think a lot of people are attempting to do that through water. So there's a lot of stuff about thinking about ancestral forms, and water is one of the sites of them. Certain kinds of ancestors hang out in certain forms of water. There's a lot of stuff, this whole cult of Mamiwata, this massive transatlantic water goddess. And I see a huge major Nigerian feature film has just emerged on Mamiwata. So, I think there's partly through climate change, people are engaging much more with questions of water, but I think partly also it's overlaid by this idea as water as one of a really interesting route into pre-colonial forms.
Thanks, Isabel. Those of you who have questions, you can unmute yourself and ask the question, but could you please put up your hand first so I can call on you? Your virtual hand is fine.
And I'm just going to get some water. Be back in a second.
Sure. Yes, Lakshmi, I see you. Let Isabel come back into the frame and you can ask your question.
Okay.
Would you like to put on your video as well?
Actually, I'm always scared of the bandwidth, Teju.
Oh, okay.
So I'd rather that the audio is clear.
All right, go ahead. Lakshmi asking your question, Isabel.
Yeah. Is Isabel back?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, great. Well, wonderful presentation, Isabel. And I'm not going to try and ask you stuff on the Elemental project. I still have to get my head around it. And I haven't read Dockside Reading, but I will, and certainly after this talk. But I'm kind of curious about, it's obviously a very, very different way of looking at reading and the whole history of the book that you want to see, not cited in the library, but in the Dockside. So I think that's a great entry point. Having said that, I'm kind of curious about the, the challenges of sort of ironing out custom officials as one category. Do we ever find an exceptional custom officer? Somebody who might have liked to read? Somebody who did not just look at them as cargo? And I ask this because I think in a study of this kind, that one exception might produce a very different microhistorical perspective and might in fact strengthen your narrative, even while appearing to be different. So I'm just curious about the figure of the custom house official, because one looks at the archive and one looks at these infrastructures of reclamation of one kind or the other, and then one is struck by one deviant voice who actually happens to be the most interesting source for the story that you tell. So I'm kind of curious about the category of this, formulaic custom officer who does not read. So any thoughts?
Okay, fabulous. Thank you so much. I think, many different thoughts. I was very aware while writing this book, and I probably did fall a bit into this trap, to have the sort of cloddish colonial official. It's a very sort of handy kind of set of stereotypes to resort to, and I'm sure I've sort of fallen into that trap quite often. I think on the reading, this is saying one would need to think about what they actually did on the dockside, and then what they did in their private domain. And I'm sure partly because the customs officials really did consider themselves as something of an empire within an empire. So they never reported directly to the colonial, the colonial office, the foreign office in its previous incarnations. They reported directly to the Board of Trade. And so they really did consider themselves a kind of, a cut above everybody else. They were very, especially before ports are massively industrialized, they are very powerful in ports. They really are. They are the elite of the sort of kind of port officials, and so many of them, I'm sure, in their private lives would have read. And also, if I can just say, these ones the people who are actually dealing with the books are the lower edge of the hierarchy. Okay, but I think you're absolutely right, and I'm sure some of the collectors of customs would have known some of these books. So yeah, but thank you. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. If I can just say also, there was at one point, partly through the very early, the sort of mounting climate of anti-communism and a concern about trashy popular literature, just more and more stuff is being stopped. So these customs officials actually get completely overwhelmed, and they start to resent the fact that they have to act as that they have to take on this sort of censorship role, and they start to argue that their ideal model is that of the plant inspector. So in customs, it was also the plant inspector who would come and look at the plant or the animal. There were also animal inspectors and go, yes, that's fine. There are no bugs on this plant. You can let it in. And so it was partly coming out of their own sort of epidemiological idea of reading, that somebody, an expert, would come and say, okay, fine, no contamination in this text.
Yeah.
So that became an interesting.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. But if I can just say just one thing, the one that the book also touches a bit on, the Scarlet Letter, okay, which has this whole initial section set in the custom house. And that's really interesting because also what Hawthorne is doing is he is also portraying the customs house as an anti-literary space. It's a sort of long tradition to see these customs officials as sort of slightly cloddish bureaucrats. But I suppose what I'm saying is, let's not just say, oh, well, they didn't know anything. How did they actually read?
Exactly.
Yeah, and the forms of reading, as I say, that they do are really quite modern because they are actually quite similar to a lot of sort of digital ways of reading.
I love that point you made about the analogy between digital literacy of a kind and this kind of opaque reading, but very effective reading. Yeah, I loved it. Yeah, certainly going to read the book.
Can I just say, and also just, sorry, one more thing. I think they were, in some senses, truly modernist readers, because they were not reading one book, they were reading the whole consignment, which is a completely fascinating. And it only sort of started to strike me right at the end of this project, because I thought, we see one book. That's what we do. We read that book, we pay attention to it. They weren't thinking about one book. They were thinking, 50 copies, 100 copies of this book have arrived. I am reading 100 copies all at the same time, which is actually a sort of, in some senses, a truly modernist way of reading, because reading is interchangeable commodities, they're all sort of the same.
Yeah.
So who's next? Who has a question? Please unmute yourself, Dilip.
I have, sorry. Actually, the thing is that it seems absurd to ask Isabel a question over the net when I could actually ask her in person. So I don't really have a question. I'm just thinking about trying to think through the project and have a series of comments. Because one of the interesting things really is that most historians tend to be like children standing at the edge of a pond and they send stones skimming across. And the stone skims across the surface, and they're not interested in it once it drops into the water. And I think what Isabel's work does is actually, as she says, so it's a plangent phrase, going below the waterline. What happens when we study water itself? and the oceanic water itself, rather than just studying the history that skims across the surface, pirates, trade, political movements, etc., etc. So I think that's a very potent reminder of this elemental history that she's talking about, where we also then become aware of water in its many forms, and particularly in relation to the book, where we are thinking about things like humidity, we're thinking about reading in the icy wastes of the Antarctic. And it's not just water anymore, it's thinking about the water as a source of danger to the book. We're thinking about the forms of, and the beautiful example of what do you do, which she drew upon from Joshua Calhoun, that we're thinking about the insects that inhabit books. It's not only colonial officials who redact pages, it's those of us who worked in the archives know that silverfish redact multiple pages. You know, that sometimes a document becomes unreadable because the silverfish has decided to eat the words of the author. And so I think this kind of very, very sensory engagement, both with water and the book, is something that I find absolutely fascinating. And so that's really what I wanted to put out there. I don't have a question at the moment, but I think this thing of thinking with the elements, wind, air, fire, and water all together, both in relation to history as well as the history of the book and printing. And I think Isabel's work is marvelous in that sense. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. If I can just say, I think that question about what sort of water are you looking at is really critical. And if I can just do a bit of a plug, myself and colleague Sean Lavery and Sarah Nuttall did a special issue, and I'll put it in the chat. We did a special issue called Reading for Water. And what we did was we asked colleagues to choose any South African or Southern African book. Could be something they knew well, could be something that they were interested in, didn't matter, but they had to choose this one text and then go and read absolutely minutely for water. You know, and that was just really fantastic. It just, you know, everybody was very excited by the project. It was really, you know, interesting. And the special issue itself, and I think particularly the introduction, is just a fabulous sort of toolkit of methods. So I've taught it in Johannesburg and I've taught it in New York, and it's really, you know, it works extremely well as the set of ideas, getting people to think about, okay, you know, what are, you know, as you say, water is in these endlessly many different forms, you know, and what implications, if you're a literary scholar, does it matter? You know, things like how can you think about, you know, there's very interesting work now on, can you think, for example, about hurricanes as a literary region? You know, there are Mauritian scholars who are working on that. But let me just get out I'll just put up I'll get up the reference and put it in. Where is it? Where is it? There we go.
And this reading for water, I think, is also comes up with reference to texts that we already know deal with the ocean. So if you're reading, I reread Moby Dick after a very long time, and while it is indeed a story of an intransigent man hunting down a whale and so on, the whole book is full of descriptions of water, the ocean, the winds, and so on and so forth. So what appears to be merely background then becomes foregrounded once begins to read for water. So it's less a story of Ahab and Moby Dick and more a story of the ocean.
Yeah. I mean, there's the wonderful example. I mean, just if I could give you two examples that are touched on briefly in this introduction. There's a very prominent South African writer called Marlene van Niekerk, and she's written a book called Achat. If you're interested, there's an English translation, and it's a reinvestigation of this form of the farm novel, okay, which is very central in South African literature and has been very famously discussed by Jacob Coetzee. And actually, if you look at her book, it's all about how the farm really is its water. because obviously that's, water is central to land dispossession, because if you're going to, you go after the bits of land, you want the bits of land with the water on. And so it's a wonderful sort of, and she's thinking about water at every, groundwater, water in the atmosphere, thinking about water at every possible level. And so the space of the farm becomes more vertical and volumetric rather than simply this horizontal patch of land, which is how most people think about it. And then there's a wonderful book by A.C. Jordan called Wrath of the Ancestors. I'll put it up if you're interested. Wrath of the Ancestors, which is translated from Xhosa. And there, it's a fascinating book. It's set in a part of the country where there's a strong belief about ancestors living in particular kinds of waters. And when a royal chief died, they would often be buried in water. And so that becomes a really important part of the story. And it's a really interesting way then of thinking about the sort of South African novel as being distributed, as much on and underwater as on land.
If I may jump here.
We haven't got the links, Teju. Has Isabel put that on chat? Because
she hasn't, as far as I know.
Okay, okay.
It's not appearing. It's not appearing.
I'm seeing it.
Okay, okay, I can now see it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, I just wanted to jump in here to ask a question. Isabel, you mentioned a new Nigerian film about water, yeah? And I just wondered, and you've tracked the kinds of, books that were addressed by the customs officials in the whole question of what you call hydrocolonialism. And I wondered how that is represented in popular cultural forms in South Africa or Southern Africa. You mentioned the idea that your student had come up with, the idea of the water spirit, but I wondered in terms of representations of such water communities, water spirits, water Creole forms that you talked about earlier, what would you find? And how might one then archive those?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's, as I say, it's a very powerful strand in popular culture. So, if you go out, even in parts of sort of suburban Johannesburg, where there's it's the idea is that it must be living water. So it's water that's moving fairly quickly. So if you go to Dillip, there's the bottom end of Delta Park has got a little small waterfall. So if you go there early on any Saturday or Sunday morning, people are being baptized. Okay, so that's a drawing, and it's a classic sort of creolization of both sort of pre-colonial forms with certain African indigenous Christian forms, and so that's a very powerful strand. It's taken up a lot in it's taken up quite a lot in certain films. The figure, again, which is a sort of mermaid type figure, is Mamlambo. So there's several films, there's short stories that explore this particular kind of figure. And then you get variations of that in Zimbabwe. It's in Juzu, which is a mermaid type figure. And there's, in fact, in the special collection that we did, there's a wonderful rereading of a famous Zimbabwean novel called Butterfly Burning, which is set in absolutely in a landlocked city in Zimbabwe. And everybody thinks about this novel as perfectly dry. But Confidence Joseph, who's written this article, looks very carefully and argues, in fact, that the central character has to be understood as one of these Mamlambo kind of figures. So it's a very, very powerful strand. It's a very powerful lived reality There are many kinds of representations of it. And then, of course, anywhere on the coast, you get, again, beaches are often used as sites of, because the ocean is one of the realm of the ancestors, people are being baptized, they are taking water with them. It's a site of pilgrimage and healing and restoration and all of those kinds of features. Yeah, so it's a very powerful strand across a lot of popular culture.
Are there any other hands going up? Riaz has something to say. Can you read this question in the chat box, Isabel?
Okay, so thank you so much for this wonderful talk. When it comes to the question of hydrocolonialism, I find the parallel thinking with regard to the pilgrims' belonging, especially the work by the political figures or certain kinds of books, such as translations of the Quran. Do you also address how people experience the modes of censorship and how these travelers respond to these new methods of regulation on what would be carried and what should not be? Okay, thank you. It's a really great question. And I think obviously, and I didn't really go into this in great detail, but alongside all of this customs surveillance are a lot of forms of smuggling. Okay, so huge stuff is sort of going in and out, sometimes obviously with the complicity of the customs official. Okay, but also I was very surprised. I thought, looking at the Durban material, that I would see a lot of Gujarati titles being stopped. Okay, and there were hardly any. So I suspect all of those kinds of things, just to prevent, not that they were, a lot of them weren't seditious in any way, some might have been, but I think it was just such a hassle to get snarled up in the custom house that people had, alternative routes for bringing all of this stuff in. And then there's a lot of work, obviously, on radical literature passed amongst seafarers, that's quite well established. And you would get all sorts of kinds of interactions. Durban was, you would get interactions between Lascars and African dock workers, where there was apparently quite a trade in secondhand clothing. And I'm sure also possibly, the odd book passed through it. So there were many different sort of channels going on all at the same time.
Isabel, Gujaratis don't export books. You should know that by now. We have better things to export.
No, but the truth is that there were these books that were stopped at customs. So could you speculate on what the books might have been?
See, the seditious writer was in South Africa. So, the Gujaratis here were happily writing novels.
Those with cultural capital and those are on the fringes of it, right? It's really...
There's a hand raised. Riaz, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful talk again. And I was thinking the same way, like I was reading a Hajj narrative, a pilgrimage narrative written by Oxford professor who traveled via Himalayas through Bolshevik Russia. Then how he stopped for carrying an English camera, right? So there is this kind of a fear against, even for the people who are carrying English objects, how they were being, prevented from entry to the spaces because they are carrying a small object which is built in England. So all of these things are coming together. When we see this hydrocolonialism, in some sense, we can even apply those theories of hydrocolonialism into rather some extent when we look at it in a very in an extensive way. That's what I was thinking about.
Thank you. Yes, it's really true what you're saying. I think, and because I suppose that the kind of hydrocolonialism that I'm talking about here is very much this maritime colonial frontier. And so, as you say, the really interesting thing then, I think, on that frontier is this idea of mark of origin, that you have to come from somewhere, and that somehow that is a mark. And so, as you say, it's often this thing of, suddenly this, how did you know this was an English object? But it's, that was the sort of thinking of crossing frontiers or objects that were seen as somehow out of place. And then obviously with immigration restriction, which really in South Africa kicks in from about the 1880s and the 1890s, this idea of mark of origin is then more or less transferred onto people. So only those with the correct, if you're from some parts of the world, you carry the wrong mark of origin. If you're from other parts, you've got the correct mark of origin. So I think it's this whole, the construction of boundary objects, and how then people decide on origin and provenance, which becomes this, highly sort of politicized question.
If I may, I was just thinking as Isabel was speaking about Arjuna Padare and Netta Alexander's recent book on failure. And very often, most of our narratives are about people going from point X to point Y, books which are written by authors which find their way to a publisher and then to the market, and then people read them. And there's a constant short-circuiting happening, right? The censor decides this won't work, and so the book doesn't make it past the port. Ambedkar sends his consignment of books on a ship. The ship sinks, the books are lost forever. There are books, files lying in the archives which get eaten up by insects. So there's this constant sense of failure which dogs these narratives of success with which we write our histories. And I found that absolutely fascinating, because it also then brings us back to Anat Singh's idea of friction, that all these objects exist in friction with multiple, not only with humans, but with the elements. And I think this kind of argument also then cautions against us, against the unconscious hubris with which we write our narratives. So if you're thinking, I'm just thinking about the papers that were presented last year, for example, merchants who maintain extensive diaries, and then we go and we transcribe them, and we have this history of mercantile capital on the ocean. Or you go to the colonial archive, and suddenly all these small voices begin to speak to us, people who transcend colonial boundaries, engage in acts of resistance. But there are all these other modes of friction which actually short circuit these multiple narratives that we deal with. And I think what Isabel is on to actually allows us a more philosophical engagement with the ways in which we produce narrative itself. So that's just something that struck me.
Yeah, I think I found, as I said, this Joshua Calhoun book really suggestive, because it's also, much more thinking about corruptibility and decay and what does it mean then to think about, the archive or forms of communication, not as stable, or, but as fragile and, prone to decay. And yeah, so I think, I'm sure, it's sort of a combination of getting older, where you're much more aware of those things, but also the sort of general state of the world, where you really have to think about sort of decay and loss and all of those sorts of things.
Isabel, would you like to tell us something about the progress on the elemental reading book? When can we expect it out?
It's really, as you can see from what I was saying, it's really, really, really early stages. But I've got, if I can tell you, I've got really interested in, so I was looking at the accounts of the pest beetle eating these documents. And then I got really interested in the actual, what they used to fumigate, okay? So they discuss all the different, we use corrosive sublimate, and we use this, and we use that. So I didn't know what any of these things were, so I went to go and try and understand. And of course, they are the most extraordinarily poisonous gases and substances. So this is late 19th and early 20th century. But I then also realized that it's a story about the history of insecticide, so which is obviously a history also that's tied up with war, and chemical warfare becomes pesticide, becomes more chemical warfare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then just quite by chance, I realized that one of the substances that they used from the 1920s was in fact Zyklon B, which was the Holocaust gas, which started off life in Germany as a sort of anti-lice insecticide thing. So I just, suddenly realized it's also this much, one of the bigger stories in this is in fact then questions of insecticide. And then also just, as a sort of footnote to that, it was also really interesting to see which parts of the state are then called on to deal with this. So initially, interestingly, they get the immigration department to come and do the fumigation. And that's because immigration was sort of pretty much worked very closely with the port health authorities. And they were the ones who then had expertise in fumigating, clothes, objects, people, all of that. And then, but then from about the sort of, turn of the century, you have the rise of this figure of the government entomologist, who's a really fascinating figure. And of course, they simply then think about the archives as a series of plants, because that's how they think about insects. This insect eats these things and these things. So they've got this wonderful image of the archive as a sort of kind of like a herbarium, and their whole imaginary of all of these insects. And so it's, it's, as I say, it's very early stages, and I'm trying to understand this. And I've also signed up for an online course with the University of Alberta called Bugs 101. So I'm trying to learn about insects.
So in fact, you have all the books from your earlier projects are now living beings, right?
It's absolutely.
Or biological beings. Dilip, you wanted to say something?
I just, on the insecticide thing, I wonder what would happen if I were a giant and holding a large archive like I do, and which would not allow me to kill the insects. And are there other discussions taking place about the nature of violence and non-violence and the right to life of the insect? I'm reasonably certain that somebody would have raised that question. You don't necessarily need to be a giant to do that. But
I'm just really fascinated about what do you do with insects in your archive?
No, I'm not a giant, and no, I think there is a large repository of giant texts that I look after, one of the country's largest, and fumigation has always been a theological issue there in that archive, because you're taking life. So do you take these papers out? These are 1,000-year-old manuscripts, even some even older. So do you take them out in the sun? What do you do? These things have been debated by people who look after the Jain archives, because Gujarat and Rajasthan has a preponderance of these large repositories, quite often Jain dominated, and these have been real questions. So some people have said, we should allow the manuscripts to be eaten. Others have said no, because the damage to knowledge would be something which is irreparable. What do you do? So I just wondered if there were such questions that you would encounter.
Not as yet, but I'm really fascinated. Also to understand what are the sort of quote unquote modern forms of dealing with insects in archives, because presumably one no longer uses these poisonous gases.
No, we do. I know that there is a large fumigation chamber being planned at the National Archives of India.
Okay.
Right? This is good.
And you know,
I'll get you the details of the chemical compounds used,
Yeah.
but um, also the restoration of papers
Right.
requires use of chemicals which then kill forms which, life forms which have come in.
Yeah.
So those practices continue. So for example, at Sabarmati Ashram, since we were allowed to kill a snake, as you know, and so what's a bug? So we quite happily, without really going into questions of violence and non-violence, um, heated paper, right? And
No, but
I'd be most grateful if you can send me those details.
no, but that is a very interesting question. We were looking at, I was working at the Godrej Archives, which is not compromised by any sense of violence. Been recording the various shifts in fumigation techniques over the last 20 years. So there's a lot of debate on what is effective and what is not effective. And it brings back the question not so much of human, non-human interaction, but the question of how important it is for us to have an archive. So in many ways, through fumigation, there's a lot of interesting debate on the importance of maintaining collections. So I think, there are ways of approaching this. So rather than, you were talking about loss and decay. With business houses, which are trying very hard to put their archives together and make some sense of it, there seems to be a lot of rational discussion on why it's important for us to really be super professional, quote unquote, about maintaining our records.
And one favorite material these days is nitrogen chambers, as you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Dilip, you have a comment or a question?
I have two comments, just go back to, to stay with this discussion, also to go back to something that Isabel said. One of the questions that has come up very recently is with regard to the larger question of the repatriation of objects, like the return of the Benin bronzes, return of objects from museums, and so on. And so more and more conservators are raising the question of the kind of treatment that these objects have undergone in these museums in the metropole, and what are going to be the consequences of the return of these toxic objects, right? So there's a whole discussion on that. Isabel, I can send you a link because I started reading up on this, and this is really interesting. The second thing with regard to insects is that I think the way in which we regard insects as part of a larger cosmology that we are part of. There's a wonderful book by Luc Ferry called The Ecological Order, where he talks about the 13th and the 14th century, where the church was obviously concerned about insects eating crops, insects destroying valuable manuscripts, and so on. So the church saw these insects as being culpable, right? Because as part of the great chain of being, humans, as much as insects, were culpable for their actions. So the insects should be summoned to ecclesiastical courts. And the lawyer arguing on their behalf would say, oh, my lord, these poor, humble creatures cannot make it to the court. The way is long, they'll be weary, and so on. So they may be pardoned. And so the insects were pardoned. So there are a whole set of discussions of this, and this idea of the culpability of insects and the fact that insects and animals did things for which they should be punished, but they could not be punished, continues all the way through to the 19th century. Like Evans's book on the criminal prosecution of animals, it shows how horses and pigs were actually prosecuted in English courts in the 19th century for kicking their masters and that kind of thing. But the insect question in the 13th and the 14th century is very, very interesting precisely for this reason, that they were seen as part of the order to which humans belonged. But anyway, that's... But this is what any paper by Isabel does. You go off in like a million directions. Thank you, Isabel.
But it's the same thing, in sort of early modern England, if a book was deemed to be especially egregious, it was also sort of put on trial. There was a whole thing, and the book was displayed and harangued, you know, so it's a really fascinating thing. And also under the Dutch at the Cape, if you know, it goes back to the sort of thing about the sea as the construction of the sea as a dumping ground. But anybody convicted of sodomy, if it was two people, they were tied together and executed by drowning. But if it was sodomy with a horse, then the poor horse was also drowned.
That's sad.
Yeah.
Dilip, can we end
You
on
must end on an exalted note here. I mean, you've ended with sodomy on a horse. You could.
Yeah, that's a great place to end things.
Any other questions,
Sorry.
comments? Dilip, you anything else to say?
No, I'm fine.
Well, just to say thank you. That was delightful.
Thank you, and thank you,
As
everybody.
Isabel always is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for providing such a a rich and fertile space for conversation for us. This
And
is really engaging.
Any ideas on elemental reading and insects? Fumigation? I want to hear it.
Current concerns.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thank
All
you.
the very best with the completion of the book
Project.
that we are working on now.
Thanks.
And we look forward to seeing you in person.
Yeah,
But I
hopefully
have
soon.
some ambition of actually doing something in person. So let's see what
Okay.
happens with that.
Fantastic.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, Tridip. Nice to see you too.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye. Bye.